Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The elusive search for justice. Should individuals, including government officials, be legally held to account for starting aggressive wars, like in Iraq? Is it fair and moral that Bush-era officials be given immunity from prosecution? If they're not held accountable, then who is ultimately responsible? To CrossTalk Crimes and Punishment, I'm joined by Inder Comar in San Francisco. He is the chief counsel on the case seeking to apply the crime of aggression against members of the Bush administration. And in New York, we cross to Ed Krayewski. He is an associate editor at Reason 24/7. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. And if I can go to you first in San Francisco, you're representing the plaintiff in this case. Could you tell us a little bit about the plaintiff and what is the case?
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter, and it's a pleasure to be on. My client is an Iraqi woman, an Iraqi single mother who fled from Iraq, in the aftermath of the war in 2005. She's a refugee now in Jordan, where she is supporting her dependents, essentially, by herself. And what she's alleging in her complaint against 6 defendants, 6 Bush administration officials, including George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, and Paul Wolfowitz, is that these 6 defendants planned and waged a war in violation of the Nuremberg principle against aggression. So she's alleging that the war was planned starting in 1998 at a small nonprofit called the Project for the New American Century, which Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, and Paul Wolfowitz were members of, and that after they planned the war, these people used 9/11 as a cover, as an excuse to scare and mislead the American public and the international community to support a war. And then she alleges that the war, finally, when it happened, did not have proper legal authorization under various treaties, including the UN Charter, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and the Nuremberg Charters. So that's the heart of the case, and the case was filed in March, and as you mentioned, in August, the Department of Justice filed this Westfall Act certification, which is a request to the court that these 6 defendants be essentially immunized from civil proceedings.
Okay, Ed, I think everything that Inder just said, most critical people would agree with, but is there a case? Because we do have federal statutes that can just give immunity to all of the individuals that Inder just mentioned.
Yes, they can, and that's the federal statutes on the federal level, but the same thing also happens on the local level. Often when there's police brutality claims, when there's a settlement that ends up coming out, the settlement will always say that nobody accepts any liability. So I think while the work Inder is doing is important, it's a long shot to have expected the Department of Justice not to immunize these officials, because moving forward, Barack Obama, when he's out of office, and Eric Holder and whoever else, when they're out of office, they're not going to want to have to be held responsible for anything that might be in the future considered illegal that they're doing now.
Well, Ed, you got way ahead of me. You got way ahead of me on this program, because that's exactly what I wanted to ask, and I think that Inder's work is actually very valuable, because Barack Obama is going to just, basically pardon himself, okay? Because this is essentially what's going on here. This is a culture of impunity here. Inder, it's been mentioned, it's a hard case. What else do you want to achieve by it? Just awareness?
Well, no, I think actually, people say it's a hard case, and I think what's hard about it, or I think what people, what's innovative or novel about the case is just applying these rules equally. So let me give you a common law example. In the common law, premeditated murder is the worst crime you can commit. Self-defense is not a crime, right? If you kill somebody in self-defense, there's no crime that's been committed, and that's what the common law teaches us. In international law, it's the same thing. War committed in self-defense is not a crime. It's not actionable under the Nuremberg principles. And what's interesting about this case is this is the first time since Nuremberg that the crime of aggression will be actually used against anybody. So Nuremberg gave us the crime of genocide, which we apply now in international courts apply, domestic courts apply. It gave us the crime of crimes against humanity. But the chief crime, what the tribunal called the supreme international crime, is this crime of aggression. And it's interesting that for the last 60 years, it's basically lain silent and gathered dust. So, one of the chief goals of the lawsuit is actually to have a federal court examine international law, which it can do, and say that, inconsistent with Nuremberg, consistent with with the recognition of genocide and crimes against humanity, aggression itself is also a crime. And if we get further, if the court actually goes ahead and applies these rules, as I think it ought to these defendants, I don't think it's that unrealistic or unimaginable that a court could find some liability here.
And what do you think about that? Because the facts on the ground are extremely well known. We all know, or these critical minds know how we got into this war in Iraq illegally, and everything that the case that we've been presented with on this program is factually true. But at the same time, no one is going to be held responsible for this catastrophe against the people of Iraq, against all of the soldiers that went there and died, and of course the cost of it all, and the blowback that we all continue to experience.
Right. Well, now, Inder can correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember my history, I think the crimes of aggression were the hardest ones to prosecute, even at Nuremberg, right? Even though what the Nazis did was obviously illegal. Even with the crime of aggression, the international community was kind of a little more hesitant about pushing that one. Because, in theory, there's these things about aggression and wars of self-defense.
Well, I think you're right. I think what happened in Nuremberg is that, there was a debate. Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Inder. Go ahead, reply. Please do.
No, go ahead.
Well, yeah. Yeah, I think, at Nuremberg there was a debate, on an honest debate amongst the four allied powers as to what crimes are we going to bring. And, actually it was the Americans. It was the chief prosecutor, Robert Jackson, who was a, member of our Supreme Court, at the time, who really pushed for this crime. He really believed that the crime of aggression was something that was important and ought to be prosecuted. And the tribunal agreed. The tribunal called it the supreme international crime. And what they found, what was different about the crimes of that era was that there was the planning element. I mean, that's what they really focused on, was that it wasn't just, the Nazis coming to power and saying, hey, well, look, now's our chance to be aggressive. It was before that. I mean, part of the reason they wanted to come to power was to implement this plan that they had for waging war. And so what my client alleges is similarly that there were people in the administration who had a pre-existing plan, who really wanted to invade Iraq, who were part of a movement designed to basically flex American military might in the region. And when they came to power, they weren't able to do it immediately, but once there was this unrelated terrorist incident, they were able to use it as cover. So I think the planning is what makes this more appropriate for a case to consider the crime of aggression. And aggression is gaining a lot more acceptance in the international community. The ICC, the International Criminal Court in The Hague, will have jurisdiction of this crime in just a couple years. There was an amendment that was passed very recently related to aggression. So people know it's out there. People know that it's a chief important crime. It just hasn't been implemented. People have wanted to stay away from it precisely because of the accountability issues that we're all talking about.
I mean, Ed, you can go, you can get some Serbs and put them on trial, and you can get some African leaders and put them on trial, but you don't find Americans being put on trial for war crimes. I mean, it's really because they're powerful. And I find it very interesting is that the Nuremberg statutes are being even mentioned here. American officials are being looking at history and saying that the application of the Nuremberg principles should apply to Americans. It's a pretty sad state of affairs.
Yeah, but I think it's important to remember that not only did Congress authorize the use of military force in Iraq in 2002, that the regime change in Iraq was the law of the land in the U.S. since 1997 or 1998 when Bill Clinton, Democrat, signed the Iraqi Liberation Act. So while there's definitely, the idea that
that's true.
It was a very misguided war that Bush really wanted to get into, it's also that this was actually, the Iraq War was a culmination of more than a decade of U.S. policy toward Iraq.
Yes,
and
but,
not just something
yes,
that
but even
George Bush and Dick
even
Cheney
if the U.S. Congress passes these laws, it doesn't make it right, okay? An act of aggression is an act of aggression. I don't care if it gets a rubber stamp from Congress, just like with the Syria situation right now. I don't care what Congress has to say. A war of aggression is a war of aggression under international law. Inder, again, we have this case with Syria right now pending, and we still don't have this impunity. They can still do what they want because they have no fear of prosecution later.
Well, I think that's an important point, that this is very relevant in today's news with respect to Syria. And actually, I do want to take I do think, Congress's input is important for purposes of domestic law. I think there is case law out there from the 50s, where Eisenhower tried to take over a steel mill. It's called the Youngston Steel Mill case, and the court, there analyzed that congressional input is actually a very important factor in determining whether the president's actions are right. But I think the issue here is, even assuming congressional input and acceptance of these policies, whether these people can still commit crimes that are of international
not just
importance. I mean, it can't be the case, right? It can't be.
Exactly.
Well, authorization, but it can't be the case that the president can come to Congress. Well, it can't be the case that the president can come to Congress and say, I like to have slaves at the White House, or I want to, build genocide factories, and Congress somehow is convinced to do it. That's okay or legal under international law, and I think the same is true for war making. It can't be the case that if Congress gives an authorization based on flimsy or false pretenses, as we all know, or that was the case with Iraq, and what my client alleges is the factual predicate. It can't be the case that the president is somehow okay. And there are three branches here. I mean, we have to look. I think this is an issue too for the courts to really look into, because the courts under our system decide what's legal. That goes back to Marbury v. Madison. The courts are the last say on what's the law. And if aggression is the law, I think it's appropriate
to
for
decide
the
on
courts
political
to
questions.
examine these cases.
Okay, Ed, jump in before we go to the break.
Right.
Go ahead.
So that's what the Department of Justice is
Ed, jump
arguing
in. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I agree, and I think this is why the Department of Justice did what it did. I think this is why U.S. government officials, Democrat and Republican, are wary of joining international regimes like the International Criminal Court. Because you're right, a lot of the things the U.S. does is illegal under international law. But it's not illegal under federal law, and that's why they want to make sure that that's just the only law that applies. And so they're going to make this argument that George Bush and Dick Cheney and future government officials won't be able to do their job.
Okay, Ed, I have to jump in here. We have to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on war crimes and accountability. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we are discussing war crimes and accountability. Okay, Inder, I'd like to go back to you in San Francisco. I mean, essentially what this lawsuit is all about is about accountability and justice. And we have Dick Cheney walking around giving speeches and selling his books, but we have people like Manning in prison. We have Snowden on the lam, and they didn't kill anybody. They actually wanted to bring justice to others and be more open and bring transparency to government. But again, we see government doesn't want any kind of accountability and doesn't want any kind of transparency.
Well, I think that's right. And, I think the point of the lawsuit in a lot of ways is that the law needs to apply equally. I don't think that's a controversial statement to make, but it's become controversial. And I think what we see in the Syria instance in the latest news is that there's a certain sectors of our government that are so willing to just reach for the trigger, essentially, to solve international problems. And that's not the world that we wanted after World War II. That's not the world our founders wanted. It's not a world that is consistent with my sense of what America could and should be, and part of that is applying the rule of law and adhering to it. So we created this pretty fascinating international system after World War II that required UN authorization for acts of violence, where the UN said the U.S. said we're the most powerful country, but we're going to use that power justly. And I want to live in a world where that's possible. And I think the courts can apply the law in such a way where this might be a possibility to do it through the courts.
What do you think about that, Ed? Do you think the courts really want to get involved in this? Because we've seen over the last probably 30 years, executive privilege has continued to expand and expand at the expense of Congress and at the expense of the courts.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the courts really are usually reticent about considering political questions, and I think they do consider war making and foreign policy a political question. So while the ideal is great that they should be more involved, because you're right, we have three branches of government and they have their role, I think in practice, unfortunately, they've kind of taken several steps back from engaging in political questions and policy matters that matter.
Inder, are you hoping that there'll be other plaintiffs that will come and make a case as well? Because it seems to me when the Department of Justice gives immunity, or considers giving immunity, it means I have this feeling that the people that they're getting the immunity are guilty of something. I mean, why are you protecting them, giving them cover? Automatically, let's not talk about it. You can't touch them, untouchable. This is very interesting.
Yeah. Well, yeah, well, I mean, that's a great point. And, I guess why would you give this immunity? And that's something that we kind of briefly touched on initially. From my point of view, it's either just an automatic practice of the Department of Justice just doing this to former officials, former executive officials, or it's a question, I think, as was stated previously, of Obama looking forward and saying, well, in terms of the things I've been doing, in terms of the drone warfare, in terms of a potential strike on Syria, I don't want to have to face similar lawsuits in the future by victims of those acts. And I think the political question doctrine is such an interesting doctrine, and this is the Department of Justice has argued this in this case. But it's interesting because what we have here is the executive branch clothing the executive branch. It's the executive branch giving courtesy to previous executive officials and saying, well, don't worry, we'll cover you. And then we have the legislative branch not wanting to investigate or not having the ability or the political will to investigate. So, what's going on here is the system of checks and balances that our country is founded on isn't working, right? I mean, and that's why I think there's actually a very good case to be made to the courts that under our system.
Go ahead, Ed, jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think there's a very good case to be.
Sorry, no, that was it.
Yeah, go ahead, Ed.
Okay, all right, Inder, you wanted to finish your point.
Yeah,
go right
well,
ahead.
I was going to say that there's a very good. Yeah, there's a very good case, I think, to be made to the courts that, especially when we're dealing with a purely legal question, and this is what's interesting about this case, is if we say aggression is actually a political issue, then what are we saying about the Nuremberg prosecution, right? Because that's exactly what the Nazis said in their defense at Nuremberg, is that this is victor's justice. You won the war. This is a show trial. You're just basically doing this to make a show out of it, and then you're going to hang us, right? So that's what the Nazis argued, that Nuremberg was illegitimate. So if and the courts rejected that. The Nuremberg tribunal said, no, this is a legal question that requires that we can adjudicate and that we will. So if the Department of Justice is making a similar argument here that this is too political, war making is out of the scope of law, then what are they saying about the legitimacy of Nuremberg? I mean, I think that's what I like so much about this cause of action for aggression, is that the tribunal said 60 years ago, in some instances, war making is a legal issue and we will adjudicate.
Ed, it's interesting. I mean, if this were...
They did secure several not guilty verdicts.
Okay, that's true, but...
for the crimes of aggression, some of the Nazis did.
But, one of the interesting things about this case is that it could go both ways. I mean, the political establishment in Washington doesn't want this case to see the light of day because we have Mr. Obama and the crimes that he might have committed already in office. But then it can go backwards all the way back to the end of the Second World War, all the way to the present. I'm thinking about Vietnam. I don't have enough time to mention every single illegal intervention the United States has committed in the last 67 years.
And it explains why government officials are so protective about this idea of so-called sovereign immunity at all levels of government, because they don't want to be held responsible. And they use the argument that they're doing their job, they're doing what they were elected for, and that any kind of questioning of it or any kind of accountability, like you said earlier, would make it harder to do in the future. Even though, very not often is the question asked, is the government doing too much? And I think that's part of the political culture. So it's good to try to change it, and I think we do have to nudge it in that direction, but it's very difficult because not only do government officials are very protective of so-called sovereign immunity, but American people are too. They don't want to see George Bush held accountable. They may vote for Barack Obama because, oh, well, he's different than Bush and he's not a war maker or whatever. But at the end of the day, they're not going to want to hold him accountable. And even when Barack Obama starts his wars, they'll make 100 excuses for why it's different.
Okay, but I think, Inder, I'd like to go to you, but I think it's an even bigger question because I'm an American. All three of us are Americans here. Americans don't like to think of their country as an aggressor, okay? It's part of our political culture. We don't do those type of things. That's what we want to believe. That's what we're told by the networks all the time. But the fact of the matter is we're very aggressive in the world, extremely aggressive, and it's never held accountable. We're not part of these conventions where people can be put on trial. And this is something Americans don't want to face.
Well, I'm going to slightly disagree with you there, Ed, about whether or not the public wants to see accountability. I mean, I think with Syria, we saw. I mean, I was reading some of the statements coming from Congress where people were calling, 100 to 1 against intervention. I think people are tired of the wars. I think people are tired because our economy is in shambles. I mean, this is what wars do, and this is what the founders warned us about. I mean, the founders said over and over again that war making increases the power of the executive, it leads to higher taxes, and it destroys societies. And that's why, when they founded this country, they wanted to do something very different than what they had seen in Europe, because wars had racked Europe for hundreds of years. And that's exactly what's going on here. And I think people get it at a gut level. Why are we always at war? And that's what's really at issue here. This is something that President Eisenhower, Republican, warned us about when he left office. He said there's a military-industrial complex that you have to watch out for. I mean, can you imagine that coming from a Republican or a Democrat today? But that was a general in World War II who became our chief executive, and he warned us when he left office that this is what's going to happen. So I think the public gets it. I think they do want to see accountability. I think that there is another part of our culture that is so beautiful, that is about due process, that is about the rule of law. I mean, that's a huge gift that America has given to the world. And I think that there's a real struggle now to determine, what is our legacy as a sovereign, as the most powerful country in the world.
I think they're very nice words. They're very nice words, but I don't, Mr. Manning, if I can go to Ed, I don't see due process there. Snowden, I don't see due process there. And these are important cases. They're legal and they're political, and it also entails international law. And, Inder, you may be right. Maybe, let me finish. I agree with Inder. Americans don't have the stomach for it anymore, but it's mostly the cost I don't think they have the stomach for, not the morality of it. I'm not sure of that. Go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I agree. And I think also, unfortunately, as you said, with the Syria thing, most Americans were against it. A lot of Congress was against it. But I think even when Americans dislike or hate a policy, they still kind of want to like and admire their politicians. If you see George Bush's approval ratings since he left office have just gone up, and he was a horrible president. Because Americans, they want to like him. They want to like the person. And I think, unfortunately, that makes it very difficult to hold some of them accountable. Barack Obama is a very liked individual. And so even though his policies are really, really bad, a lot of people are still standing behind him because they like him, because he's a likable guy. He seems like a nice father. He seems like a good wife, good husband. It doesn't matter that he's droning
well, it should matter. Ed, don't you think it should matter? Shouldn't it matter,
it should,
though?
But it doesn't.
Well, there's a broken political system
of idolizing and lionizing and making our and hero worship towards our politicians. And I don't think that's necessarily just an American thing. I think people have a tendency to want to worship their leaders.
Okay, Inder.
I think it's a function of the system. That's how the government.
Inder, I want to ask you a question. Do you want to see George Bush in prison?
Sure.
Do you want to see him in prison?
I want to see him before a court. I want to have a trial about the war, and I want to see a court apply law. And that's all I'm asking for. I mean, I think it's not up to me. It's what my job as a lawyer for my client is to advocate her case and argue that this law is what should apply, and that she's entitled to civil, in my case, civil damages. I do think that the Iraq War, given the facts that have come out by the journalists, and we cite in our amended complaint, is every page is riddled with footnotes to major journalists who have, who are really the giants, the shoulders of the giants that I'm standing on to make this case. And I should add, a lot of journalists died in the Iraq War. Yes. I mean, a lot of people died to get us this information about what happened. And there's a lot in the public domain. There's a lot about the planning and the waging of the war. And all I'm asking is for a court to look at that, and apply law. I think ultimately, what the real issue here is this culture in some sectors of the government of reaching for the trigger at every opportunity.
All right.
The culture of automatic lawmaking.
We've run out of time here. We've run out of time. Fascinating discussion. Many thanks today to my guests in San Francisco and in New York. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules. I love it.